My name is Clara Dawson. I am 31 years old, and my life's work is the study of deep time. I am a paleontologist. My world is one of rock hammers and dental picks, of the patient, dusty work of unearthing stories that have been buried for millions of years. I find comfort in the vast, silent, and irrefutable language of the fossil record. A bone, a tooth, a fossilized footprint, these things do not lie. They are the ultimate primary source documents, a testament to a truth that has outlasted empires, religions, and the fleeting, noisy dramas of human existence. I have always believed that if you dig deep enough, if you are patient enough, the truth, in all its beautiful and often brutal complexity, will eventually be revealed. My own story, for the past 3 years, has been an exercise in the willful ignorance of this fundamental principle. I have been in love with a man, Alex Devereaux, and in my love for him, I have chosen to ignore the fossil record of his own life. Alex is a man of breathtaking beauty and charm, a man who seems to have been sculpted from a different, more perfect kind of clay. He is the scion of the Devereaux family, a name that in our city is synonymous with old money, quiet power, and a kind of intimidating, almost regal, social grace. His family home is a sprawling, ivy-covered estate, a museum of inherited wealth and carefully preserved tradition. My world, in contrast, is one of dusty labs and muddy dig sites. I am the daughter of a retired geologist, a man who taught me to love the earth not for what could be built upon it, but for the stories it held within it. We are a family of comfortable middle-class academia, a world of books, of intellectual curiosity, and of a deep and abiding respect for the verifiable fact. To the Devereaux, and particularly to Alex's mother, the formidable matriarch, Genevieve, my family was a quaint and slightly embarrassing anthropological curiosity. My sacrifice, the great and almost total chipping away of my own identity, was the price of admission into their world. For Alex, for the intoxicating and deeply addictive love I felt for him, I made a series of concessions. I turned down a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity, a grant to join a major paleontological dig in the Gobi Desert, a dig that would have made my career. "I can't be away for 2 years, Clara," Alex had said, his handsome face a mask of such loving, sorrowful need. "I can't live without you." And I, who had dreamed of the Gobi since I was a little girl, had chosen him. I endured the quiet and constant humiliations of his mother, Genevieve. She was a master of the subtle, smiling insult, of the backhanded compliment that was a perfectly sharpened stiletto. She would praise my interesting career, her tone making it sound like I collected butterflies for a living. She would comment on my sensible clothes, her eyes flicking over them with a look of cool, disdainful pity. I was a fossil from a different, and clearly inferior, geological stratum, and she was the curator of a museum in which I did not belong. I did it because I believed that my love and the child I now carried would be the bridge between our two worlds. I was 3 months pregnant with our son, a child conceived in love, a child I believed would finally and irrevocably cement my place in the Devereaux dynasty. I thought the wedding, a grand affair to be held at their magnificent estate, would be the final, triumphant chapter of my long and often painful courtship. I believed with the foolish, boundless optimism of a woman in love that once the vows were said, once I was officially a Devereaux, I would finally, truly be accepted. I did not realize that the wedding was not a celebration. It was a tribunal, and I was the one on trial. There were, of course, inconsistencies in the record. Small, strange, and unsettling details in the family history that my paleontologist's mind had registered, but that my lover's heart had chosen to ignore. The story of Alex's father, for one. He had, according to the official family narrative, died of a sudden illness when Alex was just a boy. But the details were always vague, the subject always quickly and deftly changed by Genevieve. And in the vast, portrait-lined hallways of the Devereaux estate, a house that was a monument to its own lineage, there were surprisingly few photographs of him. He was a ghost in the family's own, carefully curated, fossil record. It was my own father, the geologist, a man who believed in data over drama, who had planted the seed of my own, quiet and secret, investigation. We were having lunch a few weeks before the wedding, and I was, for the 100th time, expressing my frustration with Genevieve's coldness. "There's something not right in that family, Clara," he'd said, his voice a low, thoughtful rumble. "The layers don't add up. The stratigraphy is all wrong." He looked at me, his eyes full of a deep and fatherly concern. "You are about to have a child. You have a right and a duty to know the full and complete geological record of the family that child is being born into, for his health, for his future. For his future." And so I did it. It felt like a betrayal, a scientific and deeply personal act of treason against the man I love. But my father's words had unearthed a deep and unsettling sense of unease. "I did it," I told myself, "for my son." I took a hair from Alex's silver-backed hairbrush in our bathroom, and I, with a hand that trembled, sent it, along with a sample of my own DNA, to a clinical genetics lab under the pretext of a simple prenatal paternity test. It was a standard procedure, a formality, a way to silence the quiet, nagging, and deeply unscientific voice of my own intuition. The wedding day was a beautiful and deeply fraudulent performance. The sun shone. The string quartet played. I walked down an aisle of white roses in the magnificent gardens of the Devereux estate, my hand on my father's arm, a small but visible baby bump beneath the soft, flowing silk of my wedding dress. I looked at Alex, waiting for me under a canopy of flowers, his face a mask of such loving, perfect adoration, and I felt a wave of guilt for my secret, scientific betrayal. I was a fool, I told myself. A paranoid, untrusting fool. We said our vows. We exchanged the rings. And as the minister pronounced us man and wife, and our guests rose to their feet in a wave of warm, joyful applause, I felt a sense of profound and deeply foolish relief. I had done it. I was a Devereux. I was safe. I was home. The reception was held in a massive sailcloth tent on the main lawn. The champagne flowed. The speeches began. My father gave a warm, funny, and deeply loving tribute. Alex's best man told a series of charming, sanitized anecdotes. And then Genevieve stood up. She glided to the microphone, a tall, elegant, and terrifying figure in a dress of pale, ice blue silk. Her smile was a work of art, a perfect, beautiful, and utterly merciless thing. "My dearest friends," she began, her voice a low, cultured purr that carried to every corner of the silent, expectant tent. "My family, today is a day of great joy. We are not just celebrating a wedding. We are celebrating the continuation of a legacy, the future of the Devereux family." She spoke for 10 minutes. She wove a beautiful and deeply coded tapestry of her family's history, of their good breeding, of their unblemished lineage. It was a speech not about love, but about bloodlines, about purity. And then she turned to me. Her smile was still in place, but her eyes were like chips of blue-gray ice. "And now," she said, her voice dropping into a tone of deep and theatrical sorrow, "we come to the newest addition to our family, the lovely Clara, and the child she carries." Cold, sick dread began to creep up my spine. The air in the tent suddenly felt thin, hard to breathe. "I have, just this morning," she continued, her voice now a masterpiece of feigned, heartbroken reluctance, "come into possession of some unfortunate information. Information that, as the matriarch of this family, as the guardian of my son's honor, I have a duty to bring into the light." She looked directly at me. The entire world, the entire silent, watching tent seemed to recede, until it was just her and me. "My poor trusting son has been the victim of a terrible and deeply cruel deception," she announced, her voice ringing with a false, righteous fury. "And so I ask you now, Clara, in front of all these people, in front of the man whose name you have just taken, can you please tell us, who is the real father of the child you are carrying?" It was a nuclear bomb, detonated in the middle of a fairy tale. The silence that followed was absolute, profound, and soul-destroying. I could feel hundreds of pairs of eyes on me, their warmth and joy of a moment ago now, a wave of cold, hard, and deeply satisfying judgment. I looked at my husband, at Alex. His face was as white as the tablecloth, his eyes wide with a mixture of shock, of horror, and of a weak, pathetic, and pleading confusion. "Clara," he whispered. "What is she talking about?" He was not defending me. He was questioning me. In that single, terrible moment, he revealed himself. He chose his mother. He chose the lie. And it was at that exact, perfect, and beautifully, horribly ironic moment that I felt my small beaded evening bag, which I had placed on the table beside me, begin to vibrate. A soft, gentle, and insistent buzz. It was a notification. An email. From the genetics lab. The results were in. The truth, as it always eventually does, had just arrived. The vibration of the phone against the polished wood of the table was a small, almost imperceptible thing, but to me, in that moment of profound, suspended silence, it was as loud as a gunshot. It was a signal, a lifeline, a piece of hard, empirical data arriving in the middle of a chaotic, emotional storm. The wife in me, the woman who had, just moments before, been gazing at her new husband with a heart full of love, was reeling. The humiliation was a physical thing, a wave of heat that washed over my skin, followed by a chilling, nauseating cold. I could feel the eyes of our guests on me, 100 pairs of eyes, their expressions a mixture of pity, of morbid curiosity, and of a smug, satisfying "I told you so." They were watching a public stoning, and I was the accused. I looked at Alex, my husband, the man whose vows I still felt warm on my skin. He was not looking at me. He was looking at his mother, his face a mask of pale, pleading confusion. He was a small boat, caught in the gravitational pull of her massive, monstrous planet, and I was being cast adrift. The pain of that realization, the pain of his instant and total abandonment, was a sharp, physical blow. It was the moment the fairy tale died, and the cold, hard, and unforgiving reality of my situation revealed itself. But as the wife, the lover, the foolish, hopeful girl began to drown in that sea of shame and betrayal, another part of me, a part I thought I had left in the dusty labs and the wind-swept dig sites, took over. It was the paleontologist. It was the scientist. And the scientist does not panic in the face of a crisis. The scientist assesses the data. My mind, which had been a chaotic storm of emotion, became a quiet, clean, and well-lit laboratory. The shame, the grief, the rage, they did not vanish. They were simply compartmentalized. They were filed away under emotional contamination to be dealt with later. My primary operating system, the part of my brain that deals in logic, in evidence, in the slow, patient, and irrefutable process of uncovering the truth, came online. Hypothesis. My mother-in-law, Genevieve Devereaux, has publicly accused me of infidelity and of carrying a child that is not my husband's. Guarding evidence. Her public statement. The reaction of my husband, which indicates, at best, a complete lack of faith in me, and at worst, a possible complicity in the accusation. Evidence, the data. The unopened, and therefore pure and untainted, data that was, at this very moment, waiting on my phone. The decision was not a decision. It was a protocol. In the face of an unsubstantiated and hostile claim, one must always go to the primary source material. My hand, which had been trembling, was suddenly as steady as a rock. I reached for my small beaded evening bag. The silence in the tent was so profound, I could hear the soft rustling sound of the silk. Every eye was on me. They were expecting tears. They were expecting a hysterical denial. They were expecting a scene. They were about to get a lecture. I took out my phone. The screen was bright in the dim, candlelit tent. I ignored the gasps of surprise, the whispers of how inappropriate. I swiped the screen open, and I navigated to my email. There it was, an email from the Keystone Genetics Laboratory. The subject line was simple and beautiful. It read, "Your results are ready." I did not open it immediately. The scientist in me understood the importance of methodology, of establishing a clear and unassailable chain of evidence. I stood up. I did not look at my husband. I did not look at his mother. I looked out at the sea of our wedding guests, at the jury of my peers, and I began to speak. My voice, when it came, was not the voice of a hysterical, wronged woman. It was the voice of a professor, of a paleontologist beginning a lecture. It was calm. It was clear. It was precise. "Good evening," I said, my voice amplified by the microphone that was still live on the podium. "Please, forgive this interruption. My mother-in-law, Genevieve, has just presented a rather fascinating hypothesis, a theory about the genetic provenance of my unborn child. As a scientist, I find myself in the unique and rather unexpected position of being able to address this theory, not with emotion, not with denial, but with hard empirical and peer-reviewed data." A low, shocked murmur went through the crowd. This was not the melodrama they had been expecting. This was something else entirely. I saw my father, in the front row, a look of profound and deeply proud understanding on his face. "You see," I continued, my voice gaining in strength and authority. "As a paleontologist, I have a deep and abiding respect for the truth. It is a story, the ultimate story, that is written in a language that cannot lie. And so, a few weeks ago, out of a simple, and I thought, innocent, desire to understand the full genetic history of the child I am carrying, I submitted a series of DNA samples to a laboratory for analysis." I looked directly at Genevieve. Her triumphant, sorrowful smile had frozen on her face. A flicker of something, of a deep and profound unease, had begun to enter her cold blue eyes. "And the results of that analysis," I said, holding up my phone, "have just, with a sense of timing that is either divine or simply, beautifully, statistically ironic, arrived in my inbox." I walked, with a calm and deliberate pace, to the podium where Genevieve had just delivered her verdict upon me. Beside it was the large projection screen they had used earlier for a slideshow of Alex's childhood photos. I connected my phone to the system. The screen, which had been displaying a romantic, looping image of our engagement photo, went dark. "I will now," I announced to the silent and utterly spellbound room, "present the findings." The screen flickered to life. On it, in the clean, official, and irrefutable format of a laboratory report, was the first page of the results. "This," I said, my voice the cool, detached instrument of a scientist presenting her research, "is the result of a standard prenatal paternity test. The subjects are myself, Clara Dawson, and my husband, Alex Devereaux. As you can see," I said, pointing to the key line, which I had already highlighted in a bright, unforgiving red, "the conclusion is, well, it is not what we had expected. Probability of paternity, 0%. A sound, a great, collective, and deeply satisfying gasp, went through the tent. It was the sound of 100 jaws dropping in unison. I watched as Genevieve's face, which had been a mask of confusion, now broke into a smile of pure, triumphant, and reptilian vindication. She had been right. The tramp, the interloper, had been caught. I looked at Alex. He was staring at the screen, his face a mask of utter and complete devastation. He was not looking at me. He was looking at his mother, a look of pathetic and pleading terror. "So," I said, letting the word hang in the air for a long, painful moment, "my mother-in-law's hypothesis, it seems, is correct. My son, the child I am carrying, is not Alex's." I let the weight of that admission settle. I let them all savor her victory. And then I moved to the next slide. "But a good scientist," I continued, my voice still calm, still professorial, "never stops at the first result. She always digs deeper. You see, I was not just interested in the paternity of my own child. I was interested in the entire unedited fossil record of the Devereux family. The screen changed. A new document appeared. It was a second genetic comparison. This, I said, my voice now taking on a new, hard and cutting edge, is a comparison between the DNA of my husband, Alex, and a sample of DNA taken from a hairbrush belonging to his late father, the esteemed Mr. Charles Devereux, a hairbrush which has been, for the past 30 years, preserved in the family archives. I looked directly at Genevieve. The color was beginning to drain from her face. Her triumphant smile had vanished. And as you can see, I said, pointing to the new, red, highlighted line, the results are, once again, quite fascinating and quite conclusive. Subject A, Alex Devereux, and Subject B, Charles Devereux, do not share a paternal haplogroup. The probability of a father-son relationship is 0%. 1. The silence in the room was now of a different quality. It was not just shock. It was a profound and dawning horror. Alex was not a Devereux. The entire carefully constructed and jealously guarded lineage that Genevieve had just spent 10 minutes eulogizing was a lie. Alex, my husband, let out a small strangled sound, the sound of a man who has just been told he does not exist. But I was not done. The final and most devastating piece of the fossil record was yet to be revealed. Which leads us, I said, my voice now a whisper that was louder than any shout, to the final and most interesting question. If Charles Devereux is not Alex's father, then who is? The screen changed one last time. It was a third and final genetic comparison. Luckily, I said, my own dear father, in his geologist's curiosity, provided me with another sample. A sample taken from a whiskey glass that Alex's beloved uncle and Genevieve's brother, Mr. William de Winter, was drinking from just last week. I looked at Genevieve. Her face was no longer a face. It was a skull, a mask of pure, abject, and soul-destroying terror. Her brother, a man who sat at the very same table, was staring at his sister, his face a mirror of her own horror. And the results, I said, my voice a final, clean, and beautiful instrument of pure, unadulterated, and scientific truth, are as follows. Subject Alex Devereux and Subject William de Winter share a paternal haplogroup. The probability of a father-son relationship is 99.99999%. The story was complete. The fossil record was revealed. 30 years of a lie, of a dark and twisted and deeply buried secret, was now exposed in the harsh, unforgiving light of a wedding reception projector. The pure, unblemished Devereux bloodline was a fiction. My husband was not the son of the great Charles Devereux. He was the product of an incestuous union between his mother and his own uncle. I turned to my husband, the man who had abandoned me, the man who was not a Devereux, and I turned to his mother, the woman who had tried to destroy me. The wedding, I announced to the silent and utterly annihilated room, is over. The marriage is annulled. And then I did the one thing a paleontologist, upon making a great and terrible discovery, always does. I walked away from the bones, leaving them to the judgment of the world, and I went back into the clean, clear, and beautiful light of my own and my child's true and verifiable future. I did not run. I did not flee. I walked with the slow, deliberate, and deeply satisfying pace of a scientist who has just successfully defended her thesis off that stage, down the short flight of steps, and up the central aisle of the tent. The guests, who a lifetime ago had been our friends and family, parted before me as if I were Moses, and they were the Red Sea. Their faces were a grotesque, fascinating collage of shock, of horror, of a dawning, delicious, and deeply scandalized comprehension. I did not look at them. I did not need to. My work was done. The truth, the full, complete, and genetically verified fossil record was on the screen behind me, a silent, glowing, and utterly irrefutable testament. As I reached the back of the tent, I could hear the sounds of the Devereux dynasty imploding. It was not a loud, dramatic explosion. It was a series of small, quiet, and infinitely more devastating sounds. I heard a woman's strangled sob, Genevieve's sister, I think. I heard the sharp, metallic scrape of a chair being pushed back violently. And then, I heard a man's voice, low, guttural, and full of a lifetime of rage. It was Claire's father, roaring at her, not in a shout, but in a whisper that was somehow more terrifying, a sound like tearing silk. The performance was over. The real family drama was just beginning. My own father was waiting for me at the entrance to the tent. He did not say a word. He simply opened his arms and I walked into them. He held me, and in the strong, solid, and deeply familiar embrace of the one man in the world I knew I could trust, I finally, for the first time that day, allowed myself to tremble. "The stratigraphy was all wrong," he whispered into my hair, his voice a low, rumbling sound of pure fatherly pride. "I knew it. You just needed to dig a little deeper." We walked away from that tent, away from the wreckage of a life I had almost chosen, and we did not look back. We left them to their bones, to their lies, to the beautiful and brutal truth of their own corrupted genetic code. The collapse, as I learned in the days and weeks that followed, was absolute, and it was spectacular. The story of the Devereux wedding, of the paleontologist bride and her genetic bombshell, became a legend in our city, a cautionary tale whispered at every dinner party and country club. Genevieve Devereux, the proud, imperious matriarch, the guardian of a bloodline that turned out to be a fiction, was socially and familially annihilated. Her own family, the De Winters, a clan even older and more powerful than the Devereux, disowned her. Her brother, William, the secret father of her son, disappeared, fleeing to some remote, shame-filled corner of the world. Genevieve, I heard, became a recluse, a prisoner in her own, magnificent, and now deeply haunted, house of lies. And Alex, my husband, the man I had loved. His collapse was quieter, and perhaps more profound. The discovery that his entire life, his very identity, was a lie, shattered him. He was not the scion of a great man. He was the product of a sad and sordid secret. He did not fight the annulment. He did not contact me. He simply faded. He became a ghost, a man untethered from his own history, a living fossil of a life that had never truly been his. And the child, my beautiful, innocent, and now gloriously un-Devereux son. I learned from the full and final report from the genetics lab the truth that I had, in my heart, known all along. My brief, passionate, and deeply loving relationship with a fellow paleontologist, a brilliant, kind man who had died in a tragic accident a year before I met Alex, had left me with one final and most precious fossil. My son was not the product of a betrayal. He was the product of a love I thought I had lost forever. The paternity test had not just freed me from a lie, it had returned to me a truth I thought had been buried forever. My old life ended that day, in a tent full of lies and a single, beautiful, scientific truth. My new life began the next morning, with the quiet, satisfying act of deleting a single phone number. The annulment was a formality, a quiet, legal erasure of a story that had been a mistake from the very first chapter. I did not ask for a settlement. I did not want a single tainted dollar from the Devereux fortune. I had my own life, my own career, and my own, much more valuable, inheritance. My father's integrity and my son's future. I did not stay in the city. It was a place of ghosts, of bad memories, of a story I was eager to leave behind. I took the grant I had turned down, the one for the dig in the Gobi Desert. And for the next 2 years, I did what I had always dreamed of doing. I went to work. My new life was one of sun and dust, and the deep, satisfying ache of physical labor. It was a life of quiet, patient, and deeply meaningful work. I was not a wife. I was not a daughter-in-law. I was a scientist. I was Dr. Dawson. And I was, for the first time in a very long time, completely and gloriously myself. And in the vast, silent and windswept landscape of the desert, surrounded by the ancient, honest, and irrefutable truth of the bones of the earth, I healed. I returned not to the city, but to a small, quiet university town by the sea. I took a position as a senior lecturer and a curator at the university's Natural History Museum. I bought a small, light-filled house with a large, unruly garden. And I gave birth to my son. I named him Robert, after my father. My life now is not a grand, dramatic, or scandalous story. It is something much better. It is a quiet and deeply satisfying one. It is a life of teaching, of research, of long walks on the beach with my son, showing him the fossils in the cliffs, teaching him the language of deep time. The museum where I work is my sanctuary. It is a house of truth, a place where stories are told not with words, but with evidence. My greatest joy is to lead the school tours, to see the look of wonder in the children's eyes as they stand before the massive skeleton of a Tyrannosaurus Rex. Last week, a young girl on one of my tours, a bright, inquisitive child with eyes that shone with a fierce intelligence, asked me a question. "Dr. Dawson," she said, "how do you know that the stories you tell about these bones are true?" I smiled, and I gave her the answer that has become the new and final guiding principle of my own life. Because, I said, the bones never lie. You just have to be brave enough to look at the evidence, to accept the truth, no matter how much it might contradict the story you thought you knew. And you must never, ever let anyone, no matter how powerful or how much you might love them, convince you to bury the truth. I spent 3 years of my life trying to fit into a story that was not my own, a story built on a foundation of lies. I learned, in the most public and most painful way possible, that you cannot build a life on a flawed foundation. I have since unearthed a new story, my own. It is a story built on the solid, beautiful, and unshakable bedrock of the truth. It is a story of a mother and a son and a future that is as vast and as full of possibility as the ancient and honest earth itself.